The city of Oakland doesn't sleep. It decays in the dark, breathing through the cracked asphalt like a dying animal gasping for air. Before I started driving for Uber, I believed in the absolute sovereignty of numbers. I was an engineering student at Berkeley, a man of blueprints, stress strain curves, and the cold, unyielding laws of thermodynamics. I believed that every effect had a measurable cause and that the world was a machine that could be dismantled and understood. But the night shift has a way of grinding your logic into fine, grey dust. It started as a way to pay for my senior year, a simple transaction of time for currency, navigating the grid of the East Bay while the rest of the world dreamed. I sat in my silver sedan, the dashboard emitting a warm, amber glow that felt like a fragile sanctuary against the cold, blue flicker of the streetlights outside. I liked the silence of the 2 a.m. window. I liked the predictability of the GPS. Or so I thought. The first crack in my reality happened on 98th Avenue. It was exactly 1:37 a.m. The air was thick, smelling of salt from the bay and something sour, like curdled milk. According to the internal logic I had cultivated, the piles of trash bags lining the industrial stretch near the airport were just debris, inanimate objects waiting for the morning collection. But as I cruised past a particularly jagged heap of black plastic, the motion sensors on my car went haywire. The proximity alarm screamed, a sharp, digital staccato that sliced through the low-fi hip-hop on my speakers. I glanced at the side mirror. The bags weren't sitting still. They were unfolding. I saw limbs, thin, multi-jointed appendages that looked like charred driftwood, tearing through the plastic. There was a sound, a wet, gnashing noise of serrated teeth grinding against something hard. A face, if you could call it that, peeked out from the trash. It was a pale, translucent veil of skin stretched over a skull that had too many eye sockets. I floored it. The engine roared, a mechanical protest against the impossible, but as I sped away, I heard a rhythmic, metallic drumming. Something was cow-xe, clawing at the lid of my trunk. When I finally stopped under the harsh, fluorescent lights of a gas station 10 miles away, there were no fingerprints. There were only deep, jagged gouges in the metal, as if a giant bird of prey had tried to carry the car into the void. My engineering brain tried to calculate the force needed to score steel like that. The math didn't exist. I learned the rules quickly after that. Rules that weren't in the driver's handbook. Never stop at the 98th Avenue trash heaps after 1:30 a.m. Never look into the rearview mirror when passing the old Victorian houses on 14th Street. And never, under any circumstances, complete a full loop around Lake Merritt after midnight. I broke that last one on a Tuesday. The fog was rolling off the water in heavy, suffocating banks, turning the streetlights into blurry, necrotic sores in the sky. My app chimed. A pickup at the edge of the lake. I saw her standing there, a silhouette framed by the weeping willows. She was wearing a dress that clung to her frame, dripping wet as if she had just walked out of the depths. When she got in, the temperature in the car plummeted, the windows instantly frosting over with a layer of grey rime. She didn't speak. She just pointed toward the other side of the lake. I drove, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, the smell of stagnant pond water filling my lungs. I tried to make conversation, to use my voice as an anchor to the real world. I told her the heater was on. I told her the GPS said would be there in 4 minutes. She just stared out the window with eyes that looked like shattered glass. Halfway across the bridge, I glanced back. The seat was empty. Just a dark, spreading puddle of silt and water on the upholstery. Then, my phone buzzed. A notification from the app. The rider has rated you 1 star. I checked the profile. Sarah L. I did a search later that morning, fueled by a frantic, caffeinated desperation. Sarah L. had drowned in Lake Merritt 3 years ago to the day. The logic of the universe was breaking, replaced by a cold, digital cruelty from the afterlife. The night that nearly broke me completely involved a passenger I picked up near the docks. He was tall, wearing a heavy wool coat that seemed to swallow the light around him. He didn't smell like a person. He smelled of copper and old, wet earth, the unmistakable stench of a slaughterhouse. He gave me a destination that made my blood turn to ice, the regional blood bank. It was 3:15 a.m. As we drove, I realized the man wasn't moving. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't even breathing. The silence in the car became heavy, a physical weight pressing against my chest. I watched him in the mirror, and his reflection seemed to flicker, like a bad television signal. He leaned forward, his face inching closer to the back of my neck. I could feel a coldness emanating from him, a void that wanted to pull the heat right out of my marrow. His mouth opened, revealing rows of teeth that were too long, too sharp, and a tongue that looked like a piece of grey, rotting meat. He whispered something in a language that sounded like static and breaking bones. I felt a surge of pure, primal terror. My foot slammed on the brake as a stray cat darted across the road. The car lurched violently. In that moment of chaos, the silver necklace I wore, a gift from my grandmother, a traditional Orthodox cross, swung out from under my shirt. It hit the dashboard and dangled before the rearview mirror, catching the amber glow of the dials. The passenger recoiled as if he'd been struck by a physical blow. His skin, already pale, turned a translucent, sickly green. He let out a hiss that sounded like steam escaping a pipe. "Open the door," he rasped, his voice a chorus of 1,000 dying whispers. I didn't wait. I hit the central locks. He didn't wait for the car to fully stop. He vanished into the shadows of an alleyway, leaving behind a faint mist of red vapor and the lingering scent of decay. That silver wasn't just metal to him. It was an equation he couldn't solve, a frequency that disrupted his very existence. But the horror of the job isn't always found in the monsters that want to eat you. Sometimes, the horror is in the sadness. As the months bled into a singular, nocturnal blur, I realized that the boundaries between our world and the next are thin, and they are porous. I started getting rides from people who weren't there to hurt me. I picked up a young man once near the old airfield. He was wearing a scorched flight jacket, the edges of the leather curled and blackened by fire. He spoke about his wife, about a house in the hills he was trying to get back to. He left a 5-star review and a generous tip that appeared in my account from a bank that had closed in the 90s. He left his jacket on the back seat. When I took it to the police station, they told me the name on the tag belonged to a pilot who had gone down in a crash 23 years ago. I stopped being a skeptic. I stopped looking for the math in the shadows. I realized that some of these entities, these echoes of lives cut short, aren't looking for blood. They are looking for a witness. They call an Uber because, in their fractured, eternal wandering, the familiar chime of an app is the only thing that still feels like the world they lost. They aren't trying to scare us. They are just lost in the transit between here and nowhere. They are commuters in a city of ghosts, riding through the cold blue streetlights, hoping that this time, the driver will actually take them where they need to go. They just want to go home. And as I sit here now, the dashboard glow illuminating my tired face, I wait for the next chime. I watch the trash bags on 98th Avenue. I watch the fog on the lake. I keep my silver cross visible. I am no longer just an engineering student. I am a ferryman for the digital age, driving through a noir nightmare, making sure that even the dead get a 5-star ride to the end of the line. The engine hums, the GPS recalculates, and the darkness outside the window waits for its turn to sit in the passenger seat. Logic is a brittle shield when the streetlights of 98th Avenue begin to pulse like a dying heart. As an engineering student, I used to believe in the cold, hard geometry of reality. Displacement, torque, the predictable rhythm of a 4-stroke combustion engine, these were my gods. I understood stress loads and thermal dynamics. I believed that everything, no matter how chaotic, could be reduced to an equation. But Oakland at 1:30 a.m. doesn't care about your textbooks. Oakland, specifically the lightless stretch of tarmac bordering the dump, operates on a different set of physics. It is a physics of the void, a noir nightmare where the shadows of teeth and the silence is loud enough to make your ears bleed. I am a ferryman for the digital age, a ghost in a late model sedan, driving through a landscape that feels like it was painted in wet charcoal and oil. My GPS is a glowing blue altar in the center of the dash, its artificial voice the only thing keeping me tethered to the world of the living. But even the GPS starts to stutter when I pass the rusted gates of the 98th Avenue waste facility. The blue line on the screen begins to fray, vibrating like a plucked wire, and that's when I remember rule number 1. It isn't a suggestion. It is a survival mandate etched into the very upholstery of my car. Never stop near the 98th Avenue dump after 1:30 a.m. The air inside the car changed. It turned heavy, tasting of ozone and old, wet pennies. The heater was blasting, but my breath started to bloom in front of me in pale, ghostly plumes. Outside, the streetlights were performing a violent, rhythmic dance, on, off, casting long, jagged shards of yellow light across the asphalt. Between those flashes of light, the darkness was absolute. It was an ink-black abyss that seemed to swallow the hood of my car. I saw them first in the periphery. Trash bags. That's what they were supposed to be. Bloated, black plastic mounds lined up along the gutter, waiting for a morning that never seemed to come. But as the sodium lamps flickered, the bags didn't just sit there. They shifted. They didn't roll with the wind. They moved with a calculated, predatory grace. They were humped shapes of obsidian, their surfaces slick and oily, reflecting the dying light in ways that defied optics. My foot hovered over the brake, a reflexive instinct born of a decade of driving. I saw something in the road, a heap of black plastic right in my path. My engineering brain screamed about collision mass and bumper damage. My soul, however, screamed something much older and much louder. Don't stop. As I rolled closer, moving at a cautious 20 miles per hour, the flickering light caught the bag directly in front of my headlights. It wasn't plastic. It was a textured, leathery membrane, stretched tight over a frame of mismatched bones. It had no face, only a vertical slit that hummed with a low, subharmonic frequency that I felt in my molars. Then, it unfurled. The sound was like 1,000 dead leaves being ground into a grave. It didn't stand up so much as it inflated, its limbs snapping into place with the wet, crunching sound of breaking celery. It was a stop-motion horror, moving in the gaps between the light pulses. One flash, it was 10 feet away. The next flash, it was at the edge of my hood. Panic is a cold, oily slick in the stomach. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't think, I reacted. I slammed my foot onto the gas. The engine roared, a mechanical scream that felt thin and fragile against the suffocating silence of the street. I felt the impact. It wasn't the dull thud of hitting a trash bag. It was the sound of something dense and organic being shredded. But it didn't slow the car. Whatever that thing was made of, it didn't obey the laws of inertia. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creature's flesh snagging on my bumper, trailing behind me like a shadow that refused to be left behind. And then came the scratching. It started at the trunk, a frantic, metallic screeching, like a dozen serrated knives being dragged across the paint. My car groaned under a weight that shouldn't have been there. The back end of the sedan dipped, the suspension screaming in protest. Something was on the car. Something was trying to find a way in. I looked in the mirror and saw a hand, if you could call it that, wrap around the edge of the C-pillar. It was a collection of elongated, spindly digits, charcoal grey and tipped with claws that looked like shards of volcanic glass. It didn't have fingernails, it had needles. The creature began to pull itself upward, its movements jerky and unnatural, accompanied by that same rhythmic clicking sound of bone hitting bone. Recalculating, the GPS whispered. Its voice was distorted now, sounding like it was being filtered through a mouthful of silt. Make a U-turn into the mouth. Make a U-turn into the void. I pushed the car to 60, then 70. The narrow road was a blur of grey and black. The streetlights were now a continuous strobe, making the creature's progress across my roof look like a series of terrifying still photos. Flash, a clawed hand piercing the roof liner. Flash, a sliver of a face, devoid of eyes, pressed against the rear window. Flash, a row of needle-thin teeth, yellow and dripping with a foul, viscous ichor, gnashing against the glass. The smell hit me then. It was the scent of 1,000 years of rot, of stagnant water and forgotten graves. It seeped through the vents, filling the cabin, making my eyes water and my throat constrict. This was the smell of the 98th Avenue dump, not the smell of garbage, but the smell of things that the world had tried to throw away but couldn't kill. The scratching grew more violent. The creature began to peel back the metal of the roof as if it were a sardine can. I could see the headliner bulging downward, the fabric tearing. A black, oily fluid began to drip onto the passenger seat, sizzling where it touched the fabric. I was trapped in a mobile coffin, being unmade by a nightmare that didn't belong in the century. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling so hard I nearly dropped it. I didn't call the police. Who would believe an engineering student being hunted by a sentient trash bag? Instead, I did the only thing that made sense in this broken reality. I focused on the road. I channeled every ounce of my logical mind into the act of driving. I calculated the apex of the upcoming turn, the friction coefficient of the rain-slicked asphalt, the exact amount of torque needed to shake a hitchhiker from hell. There is a bridge just past the dump, a concrete span that crosses a dry, weed-choked creek. I knew that the streetlights ended there. Beyond the bridge was the glow of the city, the safety of the grid. If I could just reach the light, maybe the rules would change back. The creature's head, a shapeless, pulsing mass of shadows, slid over the top of the windshield. It looked at me with nothing, a void where a face should be, and the sheer emptiness of it was more terrifying than any monster. It opened its maw, and for a second, I saw a glimpse of what lay inside. Not a throat, but a swirling vortex of static and grey mist. I gripped the steering wheel until I felt the plastic start to give. I didn't brake for the turn onto the bridge. I accelerated. The car fishtailed, the rear tires screaming as they fought for grip. I swerved violently, intentionally clipping a concrete barrier with the rear quarter panel. The impact was jarring. My teeth snapped together, and the airbag warning light flickered on. But the weight on the roof suddenly vanished. There was a wet, heavy thud behind me, followed by a sound like a wet sheet being torn in half. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to check the damage. I drove until the engine temperature needle was in the red, until I was surrounded by the neon signs of a 24-hour gas station and the comforting, mundane sounds of late-night traffic. When I finally pulled over, my hands were frozen to the wheel. It took me minutes to pry them loose. I sat there in the flickering light of a Shell station, the hum of the refrigerator units sounding like a symphony of sanity. I was shaking, a deep, rhythmic tremor that started in my core and radiated outward. I eventually got out of the car. The damage was impossible. The roof of my car wasn't just scratched, it was gouged. 4 deep, parallel furrows ran from the trunk to the top of the windshield, the metal peeled back in jagged curls. There was no paint left on the rear bumper, and stuck to the door handle was a single, translucent thread of something that looked like spider silk but felt like cold iron. I looked at my Uber app. The trip was still active. The passenger name was just a string of unreadable characters, a digital glitch that shouldn't have existed. Then, the screen changed. The trip ended. I waited for the rating. My heart stopped as the little star icons appeared. 5 stars. And a tip. 1 cent. I leaned against the cooling hood of my car, the scent of burnt rubber and ancient rot still clinging to my clothes. The logic of the world had returned, but it was thinner now, like a layer of ice over a dark, deep lake. I realized then that I wasn't just a driver anymore. I was a ferryman. And on 98th Avenue, the passengers don't always sit in the backseat. Sometimes, they hold onto the roof and try to eat your soul. I checked my phone again. A new request popped up. A pickup at Lake Merritt. I wiped the cold sweat from my forehead, put the car in gear, and started the engine. The GPS recalculated. The engine hummed. And as I pulled back into the night, I made sure to check the locks. The darkness outside the window was waiting for its turn, but for now, I was still behind the wheel. That's the thing about driving for the dead. You can't ever really stop. You just keep moving, hoping that the next set of headlights you see belongs to something with a heartbeat. Because on the streets of Oakland, rule number 1 is the only thing that keeps you from becoming part of the trash. And I still had a long shift ahead of me. The dashboard clock bled 12:47 a.m., the digits glowing like fresh wounds against the cabin's suffocating darkness. I'm a man of equations, of stress-strain curves and structural integrity. I believe in the hardness of steel and the predictability of gravity. But Lake Merritt at midnight doesn't give a damn about my engineering degree. In the pale blue moonlight, the water looked like a pool of stagnant oil, unmoving, heavy with the weight of whatever has been tossed into its depths over the decades. The mist rolled off the surface in jagged tatters, clinging to the asphalt like a shroud. There's a rule among the night shift veterans, a piece of folklore passed down in the flickering glow of cigarette embers at the 24-hour gas stations. Never drive the full loop. You can pick up a fare on Grand, you can drop off on Lakeshore, but you never, under any circumstances, complete the circle. Geometry is a trap in this part of Oakland. A closed loop is a cage, and the entities that haunt the shoreline are looking for a key. I was chasing a surge price, a desperate attempt to pay off the interest on a student loan that felt more like a ransom. The ping came through, a sharp, electronic shriek that shattered the silence of the car. The pickup point was on the far side of the lake, tucked into a stretch of road where the streetlights had been dead for years. My logic told me it was just a passenger. My gut told me it was an invitation to a funeral. I saw her standing by the railing, a silhouette carved out of the fog. She didn't have a bag. She didn't have a phone. She was just there. As I pulled the car to the curb, the tires hissed against the wet pavement, a sound like a long, drawn-out secret. The door handle clicked. The air inside the car changed instantly. The heater was blasting at 80 degrees, but a sudden, visceral chill swept through the cabin, the kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin, It settles into your marrow. She sat in the back, directly behind me. I couldn't see her face in the rearview mirror, only the top of her head drenched in water. It wasn't rain. It hadn't rained in Oakland for weeks. This was different. I could hear it, the rhythmic, wet thud of heavy droplets hitting the upholstery. Drip, drip, drip. It sounded like a ticking clock made of liquid. Where to? I asked. My voice sounded thin, brittle, like dry parchment tearing. She didn't answer. The radio, which had been playing a lo-fi jazz stream, suddenly dissolved into a cacophony of white noise. It wasn't the usual static. It was a layering of sounds, the bubbling of air through water, the scraping of fingernails on metal, a distant, distorted scream that seemed to be playing at half speed. I tried to turn it off, but the dial was frozen. The digital display began to scroll through characters that weren't part of any alphabet I knew, symbols that looked like jagged teeth. The smell hit me next. It was the scent of the lake's belly. Stagnant silt, rotting algae, and the unmistakable, metallic tang of old copper. It was the smell of a place where light never reaches. I looked in the mirror again, desperate for a glimpse of something human, something that made sense. The moonlight caught her. Her skin was the color of a fish's underbelly, translucent, bloated, and shimmering with a sickly, iridescent sheen. Her hair was a tangled mass of kelp and grime, draped over shoulders that seemed to be vibrating with a frenetic, invisible energy. She wasn't just wet, she was saturated. The seat beneath her was already a dark, sodden mess. I felt a sudden, crushing pressure on the back of my seat, as if she were leaning forward, closing the distance between us. The static on the radio began to resolve into words, a voice that sounded like it was being filtered through a throat full of gravel and brine. Wrong way, it croaked. I didn't argue. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes locked on the road, watching the mist part for my headlights like a curtain. I was terrified that if I turned around, I'd see what lay beneath that sodden hair. I kept driving, following the curve of the lake, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. The math in my head was failing. I was calculating the distance to the next streetlight, the speed I'd need to hit to bail out of a moving vehicle, the probability of surviving an encounter with a ghost. Then, the temperature dropped further. My breath began to bloom in front of me in thick, grey clouds. The windows started to fog from the inside, but the condensation wasn't clear. It was murky, streaked with brown silt. I reached out to wipe the windshield, and my fingers came away wet with something that felt like slime. You missed the turn, the voice rasped. There were no turns, just the loop, the infinite, suffocating circle of Lake Merritt. I realized then that I had broken the rule. I had passed the point where the road should have straightened out, but the lake was still there, looming on my right, its surface now churning as if something massive was moving just beneath the skin of the water. I looked at the navigation app on my phone. The blue arrow that represented my car was spinning in circles, the map behind it dissolving into a void of black pixels. The ETA was counting down, but the numbers were negative. Minus 10 minutes. Minus 20. Minus 30. I was driving backward through time, or perhaps just driving deeper into a grave. A wet hand, pale and pruned by eternity, reached over the center console. The fingers were long, the nails torn and caked with mud. It didn't reach for me. It reached for the dashboard, its touch leaving a trail of dark, smelling water on the plastic. It pointed toward the lake. Home, it whispered. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, the ABS pumping like a dying heart. We came to a halt just inches from the concrete barrier that separated the road from the abyss. The silence that followed was louder than the static. It was a heavy, pressurized silence that made my ears pop. I sat there, staring at the black water, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't dare breathe. I didn't dare move. I waited for the cold hands to wrap around my throat, for the sensation of being dragged into the dark. And then, the weight in the back seat vanished. The car rose on its springs as the pressure was relieved. The heater suddenly roared back to life, the fan screaming as it tried to combat the lingering chill. The radio snapped back to the jazz stream, the note sounding jarringly cheerful in the wake of the horror. I sat shaking for a full minute before I gathered the courage to look back. The seat was empty, but it wasn't dry. A massive, dark stain saturated the fabric, a pool of lake water that smelled of ancient decay. Resting in the center of the seat was a single, waterlogged lily, its white petals bruised and turning a sickly yellow. My phone chimed. A notification popped up on the screen. Ride complete. I checked the app, my fingers trembling so hard I almost dropped the device. The passenger's name was a string of garbled text. The fare was $0, but there was a rating. A single, solitary star. And a comment. The driver didn't take me all the way down. I looked at the date of the account. It had been created 3 years ago to the day. The same day, a local woman had vanished while jogging around the lake. Her body never recovered from the depths. I didn't finish my shift. I drove straight to a car wash, the kind with the high-pressure hoses, and I scrubbed that backseat until my hands bled. But no matter how much soap I used, no matter how many air fresheners I hung from the mirror, the smell of the lake remained. It lingers in the carpet, a damp, cloying reminder that some passengers never truly leave your car. Even now, when I drive through Oakland, I keep my eyes away from the water. I stay away from the loops. Because sometimes, when the moonlight hits the seat just right, I can see the outline of a wet figure in the back, waiting for the one driver who will finally be brave enough, or stupid enough, to take her home. And every night at exactly 12:47 a.m., my phone pings. A ghost signal. A phantom request. I never accept it. But the one-star review stays there, a permanent stain on my record, a cold, digital reminder that in this city, the dead are the most demanding customers of all. They don't want a ride to the airport. They don't want a lift to the bar. They want a witness. They want someone to feel the cold they feel. And they'll keep calling, keep waiting in the mist, until the circle is finally closed. The lake is patient. The lake is hungry. And I know, with a terrifying, mathematical certainty, that one night, the loop won't let me out. One night, I won't be the one driving. I'll just be another passenger, waiting for a ride that never ends, leaving wet footprints on a seat for the next poor soul who thinks they're just working a shift. The static is starting again. I can hear it in the air vents. I can feel the moisture building on the glass. I need to keep moving. Rule number 1, never stop. Because if you stop, they have time to buckle their seatbelts. And once they're buckled in, you're not the driver anymore. You're just part of the cargo. The notification chime didn't sound like a phone anymore. It sounded like a flat line. I was idling on the corner of 14th and Broadway when the screen flickered, a jagged pulse of blue light cutting through the tobacco-stained dark of the cabin. The destination was a one-word death sentence, blood bank. Not the Red Cross Center on the hill, but a windowless, brick-and-mortar monolith tucked away in the industrial guts of the harbor. My thumb hovered over the screen. Logic told me to cancel. Logic was a luxury I'd traded for rent money 3 months ago. I swiped right. I accepted the ride. The man was waiting exactly where the pin dropped, standing beneath a flickering street lamp that cast a strobing, nauseating yellow over the pavement. He didn't move as I pulled up. He didn't check his phone. He just stood there, a vertical slash of charcoal against the city's grime. When he opened the door, the temperature in the car plummeted, a localized winter that smelled of iron and stagnant water. He sat in the back, directly behind me. I hate it when they sit directly behind me. It turns the rearview mirror into a useless piece of glass, leaving me blind to the thing sharing my oxygen. But he wasn't sharing my oxygen. That was the first thing I realized as I pulled away from the curb. The cabin was a pressurized void. I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic plea for exit. I could hear the hum of the tires on the asphalt, but from the backseat, there was nothing. No inhalation, no heavy sigh, no rustle of fabric, just a heavy, unnatural silence that felt like it'd wait, pressing down on my shoulders, pinning me to the upholstery. The smell hit me next. It wasn't just the scent of a man who hadn't showered. It was the thick, cloying stench of a butcher's shop at the end of a humid day. It was coppery and sweet, the smell of blood that had begun to separate, of plasma turning to jelly. I felt a bead of sweat crawl down my spine, cold as an icicle. I tried to look at him in the mirror, but all I saw was a smudge of shadow, a silhouette that seemed to absorb the passing streetlights rather than reflect them. We hit a red light on 7th Street. The world outside was a pitch-black abyss, the street lamps failing one by one as if the car were dragging the darkness behind it. I pressed the brake pedal, and the interior of the car was suddenly flooded with a violent, pulsating red. The brake lights hit the fog outside and bounced back, illuminating the cabin in a gory, neon hue. In that red glare, I saw him. He had leaned forward. His face was inches from my headrest. He wasn't a man. He was a waxwork mockery of one. His skin was the color of a drowned lung, stretched so tight over his cheekbones that it looked like it would snap. He didn't have a pulse. I could see the carotid artery in his neck, thick and motionless like a dead wire. But it was the mouth that broke me. He was smiling. It wasn't a human expression of joy. It was a mechanical bearing of teeth, a jagged, ivory fence that seemed too large for his face. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with a static-like emptiness, reflecting the rhythmic flashing of the red brake lights. Red, black, red, black. With every flash of red, he was closer. I could feel the cold radiating off him, a frost that began to creep across the back of my neck. He didn't speak. He just leaned in, his jaw unhinging slightly, the smell of the grave pouring out of him like a physical tide. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the wheel. I was trapped in a metal box with a corpse that had forgotten how to stay still. I felt his breath, not a breath, but a cold, dry puff of air like a tomb being opened, against the shell of my ear. The light stayed red. The timer on the dashboard seemed to have frozen. Time wasn't moving. The logic of the world had snapped. I was part of the cargo now. I was the delivery driver for a thing that hungered for the very thing it was being driven to. His hand, grey and tipped with blackened nails, began to rise. It moved with the stuttering grace of a stop-motion film, inching toward my throat. I saw his reflection in the windshield, the red light turning his teeth into shards of rubies. I couldn't scream. My throat was filled with the taste of pennies and fear. Just as his fingers brushed the collar of my shirt, a touch like dry parchment, the light turned green. I didn't accelerate. I slammed my foot on the brake again, a panicked, reflexive twitch. The car jolted. The violence of the stop sent my sun visor flopping down. From the vanity mirror, a thin, silver chain swung out. It was a cheap thing, a St. Christopher medal my mother had tucked into the upholstery years ago, forgotten and buried. The silver links caught the red light, dancing and spinning in a frantic arc between me and the thing in the back. The reaction was instantaneous. The passenger didn't scream. He made a sound like a vacuum seal being broken, a sharp, wet hiss of air. In the reflection, I saw his face contort, the waxen skin puckering as if exposed to extreme heat. The predatory stillness vanished. He scrambled backward, his limbs clicking and snapping like a broken umbrella, shoving himself into the far corner of the seat. The man who hadn't breathed was now heaving, a hollow, rattling sound coming from his chest as he stared at the swinging silver with an expression of pure, unadulterated loathing. "Open the door," he rasped. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of dry leaves being crushed in a fist. I didn't wait. I hit the central locks. The passenger door didn't just open. It was thrown back on its hinges with a force that rocked the car. The entity didn't step out. It dissolved into the shadows of the roadside, a blur of grey that was gone before the interior light could even register its absence. I sat there for a long time, the engine idling, the silver medal still swinging in a slow, rhythmic circle. The red brake light finally faded as I let my foot off the pedal. I looked at my phone. The ride had been marked as completed. There was no fare, no map, just a blank screen and a notification that chilled me more than the encounter itself. A 5-star rating. And a tip. I reached into the back to close the door, my hand trembling. On the seat, where the thing had sat, there was no moisture, no blood, just a single, scorched patch on the fabric and a heavy, wool coat that looked like it had been pulled from a fire. I picked it up, the material crumbling under my touch. Inside the pocket was a pilot's wing pin, tarnished and bent, dated 23 years ago. That's when the logic really broke. I realized then that they weren't all looking for a victim. Some of them were just looking for the way back. But as I drove away from the blood bank, the smell of iron lingering in my vents, I knew the rules had changed. I wasn't just a driver anymore. I was a ferryman. And in Oakland, the river doesn't take coins. It takes pieces of your soul, 1 mile at a time. I looked in the mirror, half expecting to see him again, but there was only the void of the backseat and the red glow of the city behind me, bleeding into the fog. I kept moving. Rule number 1, never stop. Because even if they leave the car, they never really leave the ride. The fog in Oakland doesn't just roll in, it breathes. It's a wet, grey lung that exhales over the docks and the abandoned warehouses of 98th Avenue. swallowing the streetlights until the world is nothing but a series of blurred, amber halos. My hands were still shaking, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles looked like polished bone. The silver chain was tucked back beneath my shirt, the metal still humming with a phantom heat against my collarbone. I had just escaped a thing that didn't breathe, a thing that smelled of copper and old cellars, and now the silence of the cabin felt like a heavy, velvet shroud. I looked at the dashboard. The Uber app was still open, the blue navigation line cutting through the digital map like a vein. It looked so clinical, so logical. It was a grid built by engineers who believed in physics and GPS satellites. But those engineers didn't drive these streets at 3 a.m. They didn't know that the map sometimes glitches, showing roads that haven't existed since the 1989 earthquake, or picking up heat signatures in the middle of Lake Merritt where the water is deep and the silt is full of secrets. I pulled over near a flickering neon sign of a closed diner, my breath hitching in my chest. I needed to check the backseat. I needed to make sure the void was truly empty. There was nothing there but the faint, lingering scent of ozone and the damp imprint of something that had sat there minutes before. I wiped the sweat from my eyes and checked my ratings. That's when the shift happened. The terror didn't leave, but it changed shape. It softened into something jagged and cold, like a shard of ice pressed against my heart. I saw a notification. A new rating had processed from a ride 2 nights ago. 5 stars. No comment. Just a digital badge of approval from a rider I distinctly remembered dropping off at a vacant lot near the old cannery. She had been wearing a dress that looked like it was woven from spiderwebs and river mist. Her skin had been the color of a bruised plum, and she hadn't spoken a single word, just stared out the window with eyes that reflected the city lights like oil on water. When she got out, she didn't walk toward the gate. She just dissolved into the shadows between the chain-link fences. And now, here was a ghost, interacting with a server in a data center somewhere, giving me a perfect score. I scrolled further back, my thumb trembling over the glass. I started to notice the patterns I had been too terrified to see before. The girl from Lake Merritt, the one who left the upholstery soaked with water that smelled of stagnant reeds and old pennies. I had checked the app after she vanished mid-trip, expecting a report or a complaint. Instead, there was a 1-star rating. I used to think it was a glitch or a cruel joke, but sitting there in the fog, I realized the truth. That 1 star wasn't a critique of my driving. It was a scream. It was her only way to mark her existence in a world that had forgotten her 3 years ago when she went under the surface of the lake and never came back up. She wasn't angry at me. She was angry at the void. She was rating the unfairness of her own death, using my car as her last witness. The engine idled, a low, rhythmic thrum that felt like a heartbeat. I reached into the passenger footwell and pulled out a heavy, denim jacket I had found tucked under the seat weeks ago. It was charred. The edges of the collar were blackened and brittle, smelling of high-altitude wind and jet fuel. I had kept it, thinking I'd drop it at a lost and found, but I never did. I knew who it belonged to. It belonged to the boy with the pale, flickering face who had asked me to drive him to the airport. He had sat in the back, his voice sounding like static on a radio, distant and distorted. He talked about how he was late for his flight, how his mother was waiting for him in Chicago. I had checked the news later. A flight to Chicago had gone down 23 years ago, a fireball in the sky over the Midwest. He wasn't trying to haunt me. He wasn't trying to tear my throat out like the things that hide in the trash bags on 98th. He was just caught in a loop, a soul stuck in the digital amber of the rideshare algorithm. He just wanted to get to the gate. He just wanted to go home. The app chimed. The sound was sharp, piercing the gothic stillness of the car. A new request. 0.2 miles away. No name, just a string of alphanumeric characters that looked like corrupted code. The pickup location was the middle of the San Rafael Bridge. I should have logged off. Rule number 1, never stop. But rule number 2 was starting to form in the back of my mind, written in the ink of sorrow rather than fear. Some of them aren't monsters. Some of them are just leftovers. I put the car in gear and began to drive. The city of Oakland blurred around me, a graveyard of neon and concrete. The fog grew thicker, pressing against the windshield like wet wool. I felt a strange, hollow sympathy blooming in my gut. I thought about the blood bank passenger, the way he had recoiled from my silver chain. He was a predator, a parasite of the night. But these others? They were different. They were the ones who left tips in denominations of currency that hadn't been printed in decades. They were the ones who left the faint sound of a lullaby humming in the speakers long after the radio was turned off. I realized I wasn't just a driver anymore. I was a ferryman. My Uber was the modern-day coins on the eyes of the dead. They didn't have a river Styx, they had the interstate. They didn't have Karen, they had a guy in a 2018 sedan trying to pay off a student loan. The realization hit me with a visceral, crushing weight. The 5-star ratings, the small tips that appeared in my bank account from accounts that should have been closed years ago, the burnt jackets and the wet seats, it was all a dialogue. It was the afterlife trying to communicate through the only language we have left, the transaction. I reached the bridge. The fog was so dense here that the red lights of the suspension cables looked like bleeding wounds in the sky. I slowed down, the tires humming over the metal grating of the road. There, standing by the railing, was a figure. He looked thin, his clothes hanging off him like rags on a scarecrow. He wasn't looking at the water. He was looking at his phone, the screen casting a pale, ethereal blue light onto his translucent face. I pulled over. The hazards clicked on and off, a rhythmic ticking that sounded like a countdown. I didn't feel the primal urge to flee this time. I didn't reach for the silver chain. I just watched him in the rearview mirror. He opened the door. The air that entered the car was impossibly cold, the kind of cold that settles in your marrow and stays there for a lifetime. He sat down, and the seat didn't even moan under his weight. "Where to?" I asked, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the stagnant air. He didn't give an address. He didn't speak. He just pointed toward the horizon, toward the place where the city lights ended and the darkness of the ocean began. I started the trip. The app didn't give me a destination. The blue line just stretched out into the Pacific, into the absolute void. As I drove, I looked at the dashboard one last time. The ethereal light of the screen showed a message from the rider. A simple, typed string of text that made the breath catch in my throat. "Thank you for picking me up," it read. No one else stopped. "I just want to see the lights one last time." The melancholy of it was sharper than any claw. I realized that the scariest thing about driving in the city wasn't the monsters in the trash or the things with too many teeth. It was the loneliness. It was the millions of souls wandering the asphalt, trapped between what they were and what they can never be again, clutching digital ghosts of phones, hoping for a ride that will finally take them somewhere they belong. I looked in the mirror. He was fading. His form was becoming part of the hazy fog filling the cabin, his eyes two dim sparks of regret. He wasn't a threat. He was a memory that didn't know how to end. I drove on, into the grey, into the static. I didn't care about the rules anymore. I didn't care about the logic of engineering or the safety of the sun. I just kept the meter running. I realized the ultimate truth of the road. Many of these passengers aren't here to haunt us. They aren't here to scream or kill. Sometimes, they just need someone to acknowledge they were here. Sometimes, they just need a 5-star rating to feel human again. And sometimes, in the dead of the night, in a city built on top of its own shadows, they just need a ride to finally, mercifully, get them home. The car moved silently through the mist, a ghost ship on a sea of asphalt. Behind me, on the seat where the boy had been, lay a small, tarnished coin. It was cold to the touch, and it glowed with a faint, dying light. I didn't pick it up. I just kept driving, watching the fog swallow the world behind me, 1 mile at a time. I looked in the mirror, half expecting to see him again, but there was only the void of the backseat and the red glow of the city behind me, bleeding into the fog. I kept moving. Rule number 1, never stop. Because even if they leave the car, they never really leave the ride. They stay in the cracks of the plastic, in the smell of the air freshener, in the silent notifications of an app that knows more about the dead than the living ever will. And as the sun began to bleed through the horizon, a final notification popped up on my screen. Ride complete. Rating, 5 stars. Tip, $0. Underneath, in the comment section, a single word was written in a font that didn't exist in the app's code. Peace. I turned off the engine and sat in the morning light, watching the fog retreat back into the bay, leaving nothing but the smell of salt and the memory of a journey that never truly ends. The silence that followed that single word was heavier than the engine's roar had ever been. Peace. It was a concept I hadn't associated with Oakland's asphalt veins in a long time. My hands, still white-knuckled on the steering wheel, began to tremble. I looked at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a face staring back from the darkness of the backseat, but there was only the empty upholstery and a lingering chill that bit into my marrow. I was a student of engineering. I believed in stresses, loads, and measurable forces. I believed that every problem had a structural cause and a mathematical solution. But the night has a way of dissolving mathematics. The night turns logic into a thin, translucent veil that rips at the slightest touch of something old and hungry. I remembered the first time the veil tore. It was 98th Avenue, right near the industrial boneyards where the city's trash goes to die. The rule was simple: never stop. Not for red lights, not for shadows, and especially not for the things that looked like heaps of discarded plastic bags until they started to unfurl. I had seen them through the rain-streaked glass. They didn't have faces, just mouths filled with needle-thin teeth that chattered with the sound of 1,000 breaking bones. One had lunged at my car, its fingers clicking against the metal like dry twigs. When I got home that morning, the trunk was covered in deep, jagged gouges that looked as if they had been made by something trying to peel the car open like a tin of sardines. There was no insurance claim for Monster. There was only the knowledge that I had been seconds away from being dragged into the rot. Then there were the regulars at Lake Merritt. The lake is a black eye in the center of the city, reflecting lights that don't exist in the sky. Every few weeks, I'd pick up a woman near the shoreline. She was always gin-sunk, her clothes heavy with brackish water, leaving a trail of silt across the floor mats. She never spoke. She would just point toward the water's edge on the opposite side. Halfway through the ride, the temperature in the car would drop until I could see my own breath as a frantic, grey mist. By the time I reached the destination, she would be gone. No door opened. No sound of footsteps. Just a cold, wet seat and a notification on my phone. 1 star. She gave me 1 star every single time. A digital scar left by a woman who had drowned 3 years ago in a stolen car. It was her way of making sure I remembered that the water never forgets. But the night I almost stopped driving entirely was the night of the blood bank. The passenger had pinned a location that didn't show up on any civilian map, a dark corner of the wharf where the fog was thick enough to choke on. He didn't walk to the car, he simply appeared beside the door, a silhouette of jagged edges and a smell that hit me like a physical blow. It was the scent of iron, old copper, and the sweet, cloying stench of meat left out in the sun. He sat directly behind me. I couldn't see his face in the mirror, only a void where features should be. He didn't breathe. There was no rise and fall of his chest, no rhythmic sound of air, just a heavy, oppressive stillness that felt like a vacuum in the cabin. He told me to drive to the Red Cross Center, but his voice didn't come from his throat. It vibrated in the glass of the windshield. It was a sound like grinding stones. As we moved through the empty streets, he began to lean forward. I could feel the cold radiating off him, a frost that started to creep across the back of my neck. He was reaching for me, his fingers long and pale as bone, his grin widening until it seemed to split his head in two. I felt the static of his presence crawling over my skin, 1,000 tiny needles of dread. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my ribs. I knew then that he didn't want a ride. He wanted the heat inside me. I slammed on the brakes. It wasn't a calculated move. It was a reflex of pure, unadulterated terror. The car jerked violently, tires screaming against the damp pavement. My grandmother's silver chain, which I had hung from the rearview mirror as a mindless habit, swung wildly. The metal caught a stray beam from a flickering streetlight and flashed a brilliant, piercing white. The entity in the back seat let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was the sound of a dying engine, a mechanical screech of agony. He recoiled, his face contorting into something even more monstrous as the silver light touched his shadow. He didn't wait for me to unlock the doors. He simply dissolved, turning into a cloud of black soot that smelled of burnt hair and old blood, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of hunger that took weeks to wash off the upholstery. After that, I thought I knew what the night was. I thought it was a predatory landscape, a place where the living were just fuel for the dead. But as the months bled into one another, as I watched the fog roll over the hills like a slow-motion tidal wave, my perspective began to shift. I started to notice the others. The ones who didn't want to eat, but who were simply stuck in the transition. There was the kid in the scorched flight jacket. He smelled of jet fuel and ozone, his skin a map of healed-over burns. He had died 23 years ago when a private Cessna clipped a hangar at the airport. He didn't want to hurt me. He just wanted to know if the Warriors had finally won a ring. He sat in the back and talked about the 1990s as if they were yesterday, his voice a flickering radio signal. When he left, he didn't vanish into thin air. He just faded as the light of a passing bus hit him, leaving behind a 5-star rating and a tip that appeared in my account as a series of strange, corrupted symbols. I began to realize that my car was more than a vehicle. In the Gothic sprawl of Oakland, under the orange glow of the sodium lamps, I was a ferryman. I was the one who bridged the gap between the concrete reality of the world and the jagged, visceral void of the after. These passengers weren't always looking for a victim. Sometimes, they were just tired. They were echoes of lives cut short by the violence of the city, by accidents, by the sheer weight of loneliness. They were calling an Uber because they didn't know how else to move on. They were trapped in the loop of their final moments, and my car was the only thing that felt like progress. I sat there in the dawn light, the smell of salt from the bay beginning to overpower the scent of the entities. The fog was retreating, pulling back into the dark corners of the piers, leaving the city exposed and raw. I thought about the word piece on my screen. It wasn't a threat. It was an arrival. That last passenger, the one who had left the non-existent font in the comments, hadn't been a monster or a ghost. He had been a man who had spent 40 years looking for his front door, only to realize he had died 10 miles away from it. I had driven him to a suburban street that didn't exist anymore, a place that had been turned into a parking lot decades ago. But to him, in that moment, it was home. My engineering brain wanted to reject it. It wanted to scream about the impossibility of ghosts using cellular networks, about the thermodynamics of a spirit, about the sheer madness of a digital app connecting the living to the dead. But the visceral reality of the night was more honest than any textbook. The rod is real. The static is real. The void is waiting just outside the circle of your headlights. I reached out and touched the silver chain. It was cold, but it felt solid. It felt like an anchor. I realized then that I wasn't afraid anymore. I was just tired. I was a witness to a secret history of the city, a chronicle of the lost and the forgotten written in the upholstery of a used Toyota. Oakland wasn't just a city of neighborhoods. It was a city of layers, where the dead walked the same cracks in the sidewalk as the living, looking for a way out. I started the engine one last time, the sound grounding me in the physical world. The gold of the sun was finally strong enough to cast shadows. I watched a group of commuters waiting for the bus, their faces buried in their phones, oblivious to the fact that just hours ago, a creature made of teeth had been prowling the very spot where they stood. They were lucky. They lived in the world of logic. I lived in the world of the ride. I didn't delete the app. I didn't quit. Because tonight, the sun would set again. The fog would roll back in from the bay, thick and suffocating. And somewhere in the dark, near a blood bank or a drowning lake, someone, or something, would hit a button on a screen. They would be waiting for a light in the distance, a pair of headlights cutting through the gothic gloom. They would be waiting for a driver who didn't ask questions about the smell of decay or the lack of a heartbeat. They would be waiting for a ride. And I would be there to pick them up. Not because I had to, but because in a city built on top of its own ghosts, the only way to find peace is to keep moving until you finally reach the place where the journey ends. The salt air filled my lungs, sharp and stinging. I put the car in gear and drove toward the bridge, leaving the night behind, but carrying every passenger I had ever lost in the quiet spaces between my heartbeats. The road was clear. The morning was bright. But the night was already waiting for me on the other side. And for the first time, that was okay. I was just a driver. And everyone, eventually, just wants to go home.